Hello and welcome to today's episode, which deals with the composition and direction of foreign trade of India. The expert on the topic is Professor Meena Gupta and I am Monica Verma. We shall today analyze changes in the composition and direction of India's foreign trade. A study of composition and direction of trade of a country enables us to analyze the composition of trade where goods and services are bought by a country or from other countries at any given point of time. Figure out what goods and services are sold by a country to other countries at any given point of time. See the changes in their composition over time. Analyze direction of trade and see which are the countries from whom it buys various commodities at any given point of time. Changes in the relative position of different countries in exports and imports over time. Understand country-wise composition of exports and imports. Analyze position of trade in services vis-a-vis trade in merchandise. Analyze changes in composition and direction of trade in services over time. Understanding this enables us to monitor the progress of a country as a shift in exports from primary commodities to manufactured goods and services signifies that the country is moving towards a more developed economy. First of all, we shall analyze composition of India's trade and changes therein since independence. Composition of India's trade. Composition of trade refers to commodities that a country exports, though it includes trade in merchandise as well as services. It generally refers to trade in merchandise unless otherwise specified. We shall discuss each separately. Composition of exports. First, let us look at composition of exports in merchandise. At the time of independence, our exports mainly consisted of raw materials and other agricultural products such as tea, tobacco and spices. Cotton textiles and jute manufactures were other major exports. With the onset of planning, Government of India adopted the policy of import substitution, which was later changed to export promotion. With a view to diversify exports, government gave large number of incentives for promoting export of non-traditional items. Composition of exports underwent a major change. Export of engineering goods requiring more sophisticated technology and high value processed agricultural products increased and traditional exports declined. With industrialization, there has been a relative shift in exports from primary products to manufactured goods. Let us analyze these changes in details. Primary products accounted for 15.5% of total export earnings in the year 2007 and 8. Agriculture and allied products constituted 44.2% of total earnings from exports in 1960 and 61. The share declined to 11.4% by 2007 and 8. Within this group, a major decline has been in the export of tea, which was the second most important item of export after jute. Its share in export earnings declined from 19.3% in 60-61 to 0.3% by 2007 and 8. On the other hand, rice exports increased over the years to 1.8% by 2007 and 8. Minerals and ores is another category of exports of primary products and constitute 5.7% of total export earnings. Export of this item has increased with increased demand from China for its iron and steel industry. As against this, the share of manufactures in total exports increased significantly from 45% in 60 and 61 and stood at 63.3% in 2007 and 8. Shift in exports from primary products to manufacturers depicts a change from an underdeveloped economy producing primary products to a more industrialized economy. Within manufactured products, there have been major changes in commodity composition. Industrialization has resulted in increased exports of engineering goods from 3.4% in 60-61 to 23% by 2007 and 8 and came to occupy first place in India's exports. Exports of chemicals and allied products increased after reforms from 6.5% in 1991 to 12.9% in 2007 and 8 and have come to occupy the third position in India's exports. Gems and jewelry is another item which recorded spectacular growth from negligible amount to 13% by 2007 and 8. The group consisting of cotton textiles, ready-made garments, jute and leather products, which comprised most important export of India, registered a decline. The share of this group as a whole, which stood at 35.6% in 60-61, decreased to 11.1 by 2007 and 8. Export of jute, which consisted 21% of exports in 60-61, declined to a low of 0.2% by 2007 and 8. Export of leather manufacture declined from 8.5% in 1991 to 2.1 in 2007 and 8. That of ready-made garments to 6%, textiles to 2.8% and handicrafts to 0.8%. These products suffer from technological backwardness and have become uncompetitive in the international market. Most spectacular has been increase in the exports of petroleum, oil and lubricants including coal. Share of petroleum products in exports increased from a low of 1.1% to 17.8% in 2007 and 8. They have come to occupy number 2 position in India's exports after engineering goods. Economic slowdown from 2008 has resulted in overall decline in demand. As a result, all exports except those of engineering goods have declined, with maximum loss being suffered by petroleum oil and lubricants due to low crude oil prices. Manufactured goods also registered negative growth. However, steeper fall in petroleum and primary products resulted in rise in share of manufactured goods to 69.2% of total exports. Despite marked changes in composition of exports, labor-intensive, low-technology products continue to dominate India's exports, which suffer from poor quality. Need of the hour is to develop dynamic products, increase export of high-value goods, and make export more competitive in the international market. Composition of imports. Composition of imports depends on trade policy, domestic demand, and international prices. In 1947 and 48, 70% of our import consisted of machines, implements, oils, grains, pulses, cotton, fabrics, vehicles, chemicals, medicines, dyes, paper products, metals other than iron and steel, and hardware. Strategy of development adopted by the Government of India emphasized import substitution and development of basic and key industries. Government adopted the policy of import controls to confine imports to goods essential for domestic production. Industrialization and agricultural revolution necessitated import of various kinds of machinery and capital goods, raw materials, transport equipment, petroleum products, chemicals and fertilizer. Subsequently, maintenance imports also increased in a big way. Not only is the share of consumer goods low, it has fallen consistently to reach 3.5% in 2007. Most important within this group has been decline in food imports, mainly due to decline in cereals preparations. There has been an increase in the import of food and allied products in 2009 and 10 because of increased import of edible oils and pulses to control inflation. Import of intermediate goods has increased substantially since 60-61. They stood at 83.5% of total imports in 2001 and 77.2% in 2007. Most important under this category are the imports of petroleum, oil and lubricants, which increased from 6.1% of total imports in 60-61 to nearly 42% in 80-81. This was partly due to increased domestic consumption and partly due to drastic increase in price by OPEC. The imports of petroleum, oil and lubricants have seen fluctuations in crude prices in the international market. With decline in prices in 90-91, imports of petroleum, oil and lubricants declined to 23% of imports. With increase in crude prices by 40% in 2005 and 6, their imports increased to 34.2% by 2007 and 8. With recession hitting global crude prices, imports of petroleum, oil and lubricants declined to 30.1% in the first half of 2009 and 10. Increase in export of gems and jewelry has led to increased imports of precious and semi-precious stones. Import of gold and silver increased in 97 and 98 due to liberalization of imports and shift to the official channel. Import of fertilizers increased suddenly in 2008 and 9 due to increase in prices. Import of chemicals has been stable at 4.1%. Capital goods accounted for 24.2% of imports in 1991. After decreasing for some time, they again increased and reached 24.4% by 2007 and 8. There was a fall in the share of capital goods imports in 2008 and 9 and first half of 2009 and 10. This is mainly on account of decrease in imports of machinery and transport equipment and partly due to increase in share of petroleum, oil and lubricant imports. Direction of India's trade. In 2007 and 8, China, USA, UAE and Saudi Arabia were the most important trading partners in terms of exports plus imports, with a share of 9.5, 8.5, 7.2 and 5.8% respectively. Their relative position has undergone major changes over the years. Changes in the direction of imports. During British rule, most of our trade was with Britain, which occupied the number 1 position. After independence, USA became the most important trading partner both in terms of imports and exports. Share of UK in India's imports declined from 19.4% in 1960 and 61 to 2.1% in 2007 and 8. By 1990-91, India's imports from USA stood at 12.1% of total imports due to large-scale imports of capital goods, intermediate goods and food grains from USA. It overtook USSR, which held number 1 position in India's imports in 1984 and 85. Share of East European countries also declined because of disintegration. Imports from OECD countries as a group decreased from a high of 78% in 60-61 to 31.6% in 2007 and 8. This was mainly due to decline in the share of European Union with increase in imports of petroleum, oil and lubricants. Imports from OPEC as a group, which includes Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, increased from 4.6% in 60-61, 31.8% by 2007 and 8. An important development during the 90s has been increase in imports from developing countries. Asia, Africa and Latin America accounted for 18.3% of imports in 95-96. These increased further to 33.6% by 2007 and 8. An important development of the post-reform and post-recession period is slide in the position of USA from number 1 to number 4. In 1991, imports from USA stood at 12.1% of total imports, followed by Germany 8%, Japan 7.5%, UK and Saudi Arabia 6.7% each. By 2008 and 9, as oil prices moderated, China overtook not only USA but also Saudi Arabia and UAE to jump to number 1 position with a share of 11.3. This was followed by Saudi Arabia 8%, UAE 5.6%. Imports from USA declined to 5.5%. Share of Germany and Japan, 2 important countries in India's imports, also declined significantly. Trade with major trading partners, namely OECD, OPEC and developing countries, also declined. Changes in the direction of exports. UK was the most important destination of India's exports before independence. Its share in total exports stood at 23.3% in 1950 and 51. As its share declined after independence, USSR became number 1 destination of India's exports till disintegration with a share of 16.1% in 1991. USA was at number 2 position with 14.7% of exports. Japan was at number 3 with a share of 9.3. By 2007 and 8, share of UK declined to 4.1% and that of USSR to 0.6%. Japan also lost substantially. USA came to occupy number 1 position in India's exports and accounted for 18.3% of India's exports in 95 and 96. It continued to occupy number 1 position in 2007 and 8 despite decline in its share to 13%. UAE stood at number 2 position with a share of 9.7%. The third position in India's exports is occupied by China with 6.8% of total exports. Eastern Europe, which had increased its share from 7% in 60-61 to 22.1% in 80-81, lost after disintegration. Its share declined to a mere 2.1% by 2007 and 8. Exports from OECD countries, which accounted for more than 66% exports in 60-61, reached 38.8% by 2007 and 8. On the other hand, OPEC increased its share from 4.1 in 60-61 to 5.6% in 90-91. Its share increased substantially after reforms to reach 16.1% in 2007 and 8. Exports to developing countries, Africa, Asia and Latin America increased from 17.1% in 90-91 and stood at 42.3% of total imports in the year 2007 and 8. Out of these, 31.6% were to Asian countries. India's exports to all major destinations suffered heavily with global recession in full swing. Exports to USA declined to 12% and to China 5.1% by 2008 and 9. While exports of primary products and petroleum products suffered heavily with global recession, exports of manufactured goods was more resilient, though growth moderated. Though manufacturers continue to occupy important place in India's exports to USA, their growth rate declined to 2.2% as rate of growth of exports of textiles, handicrafts and gems and jewelry turned negative. While exports to European Union decreased, textile exports to EU and others continued to be positive though low. Exports of gems and jewelry were high at 24.8% for European Union and 66.2% for others, but declined subsequently. There was substantial decline in exports of chemicals and machinery to China. As USA, EU and China lost, share of UAE and other Asian countries increased. Trade in services. Services include transport, travel, insurance, software, business processing and so on. Spread of computer and telecommunications has boosted international trade in almost all commercial services, including education and health care. Globalization, liberalization and removal of regulations have contributed to sustained increase in investment and trade in services internationally. There has been a sharp increase in export of services since 1991. This is much higher than growth rate of 19% in merchandise export during the period. Export of services has increased from $4.9 billion in 1992 to $102 billion in 2008 and 9. According to FICCI, these are expected to increase to $310 billion by 2012. India is amongst top 10 exporters of services. Barring India and China, all other exporters are developed countries. India is not only moving towards services-dominated GDP growth, but also towards services-dominated export growth. The spectacular growth in export of services has been mainly on account of software, consultancy and engineering. While high growth rate of software exports is well known, the growth rate of non-software services, especially communication and business services, is noteworthy during 2000, 2001 to 2006 and 7. Share of software increased at a rate of 6.5% points to reach 45.5% in 2008 and 9. Non-software services increased by 9.6 percentage points to reach 30.9%. There has been an increase in industrial projects and consultative services, mainly in the field of power, irrigation and water supply system. In the year 2006, India earned $21.8 billion of foreign exchange through export of software, followed by business and management consultancy services worth $16.5 billion. As share of these services increased, the share of transport and travel decreased from 64% in 95 and 96 to 23.7% in 2007 and 8. US is one of major markets for exports of services from India. Its share stood at 11.6% of total exports of services from India. Imports of commercial services have become very important in recent years, reaching $52 billion in 2008 and 9. In the import of commercial services, India moved from 15th position in 2004 to 13th position in 2005 and remained at that position in 2008. The global financial crisis has both a direct and indirect bearing on trade in services. According to World Bank's Global Economic Prospect Report 2010, global economic crisis has adversely affected trade in services, though these have been more resilient than of merchandise trade. Services like transport were severely hit, which is a reflection of fall in merchandise trade. Travel services witnessed a negative growth of 3.3% in the first quarter of 2009 and 10 as compared to positive growth of 4% in 2008. Turmoil in the financial sector adversely affected export of financial services. Recap. Today, we have analyzed changes in composition and direction of India's foreign trade. We discussed the following points: analyzed the composition of trade, analyzed the direction of trade, analyzed the position of trade in services vis-a-vis trade in merchandise. Before the advent of planning, India was primarily importing finished goods and was exporting primary products. Its trade was dominated by Britain. The composition and direction of trade has undergone enormous changes since then. With economic development, it reduced its dependence on food and started importing more and more of machinery and capital goods and large amount of petroleum products needed for industrialization. Its exports of agricultural and allied products declined and that of manufactured products increased. India became a major exporter of services, which includes transport, travel, software exports, management and consultancy services, insurance and financial services. The direction of trade also underwent considerable changes. UK lost its predominant position, while USA occupied number 1 position in imports and exports of India for a long time. China has now become the most important trading partner of India. trade with OPEC countries has increased substantially because of petroleum, oil and lubricants. Another important development has been increase in trade with developing countries. That is all we have for you today. Goodbye and take care.